My name is Jessica Crow. I am the founder of Apogee and the host of Change Leader Insights. I'm so excited because today I have here with me Teri Schmidt. Teri is an executive and leadership coach at Strong Leaders Serve, where she partners with compassionate, driven leaders and their teams to transform potential into performance for positive change. I love that already. She's also the host of the Strong Leaders Serve podcast. She's an Ironman triathlete, and she currently lives in Dallas with her 3 favorite people. That's her husband and her 2 teenage kids. Teri, I am so happy to have you on the show because what you have to say, I know is going to resonate with so many people that are listening and viewing this podcast. But before we get into the questions, can you share a little bit more detail about who you are, how you got to where you are today, so people really understand the context of your expertise and the insights you're going to share?
Of course. Well, first, thanks so much for having me on, Jessica. I love what you're doing with your work. Change is all around us, and being able to lead through it well is a rare skill, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Definitely appreciate how you are supporting leaders and organizations as well. Just like you said, I am a partner for compassionate, driven leaders. That's how I see myself. They're for leaders who got into leadership, not for the title, not for the pay, not for the position, but because they wanted to make that positive change. And those leaders in particular, because they care so much, face unique challenges. So I am there to be there with them to help them get unstuck or help them get to that next level so they can actually really realize what they got into leadership for. And they can experience that, because a lot of times leaders, like I said, who are compassionate and driven, they get into it and all of a sudden it's just crushing. It's like, this was not my vision for what leadership was supposed to be like. So I see myself there as a partner to help them examine that and figure out ways past that so that they can really pursue that passion that got them into leadership in the first place.
That's incredible.
A little bit more about me. That started really young. I kind of consider myself a potential spotter, meaning I see that potential in people. And that really started with my mom. She was an elementary school teacher, and she was that kind of teacher that, the teacher that had the student the year before would say, oh, no, this is going to be a problem child. You're going to have a hard time with him or her. And she, would befriend that student, figure out what made them tick. And by the end of the year, they would be thriving. The 2 of them would have a great relationship. And seeing that very early in my life just really made that part of my core values, that each of us have this potential within us. So that has flown throughout my winding career path, whether it was when I was working at a homeless shelter, whether it was when I was in corporate life at JetBlue Airways, whether it was when I was founding my new nonprofit, or now as I'm supporting these compassionate, driven leaders as a leadership coach. It's always been about helping people to see that potential, to utilize that potential, and to remove barriers toward people getting to express that potential fully.
Wow. What a gift too. I love that story and how that's inspired you, seeing your mom role model and find the potential in others. And now you're doing the same and helping people activate it. That's incredible. And, when you and I talked last too, some of the challenges you mentioned of being a compassionate and driven leader is that this can lead to leaders burning out. And you said there's really three main reasons or things to look for or why they will experience that burnout. But you also have some strategies on how they can overcome that. I have no doubt from your experience and all your different clients that you've served and the perspective that you have that what we're about to talk about is going to be really, really impactful for those listening. So tell us a little bit about what are the 3 traps that people who are compassionate and driven as leaders who want to lead for the reasons you mentioned before, but find themselves getting into trouble. What are those 3 traps?
Yeah. So the first one is first of all, a little background, my business, my podcast is called Strong Leaders Serve. And I started getting a little bit worried because I started seeing a lot of posts about, we don't need servant leadership. That just leads to burnout. So it really made me think, okay, well, is there a misunderstanding of what it means to serve as a leader? Doing some research, that's really the conclusion that I came to. And some of these traps are some of the misconceptions that I think these leaders who are very compassionate and, want to get results as well, that they fall into. And so the first one is not serving, but rescuing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The second one is neglecting themselves. They think because they are a servant leader that they should not neglect themselves. And the third one is always being nice. That we can, we'll get into all these a little bit more, but that one shocks people sometimes. Like, aren't I supposed to be nice? I'm a compassionate, driven leader.
Yeah.
And I will say, particularly new leaders and mid-level managers are particularly prone to fall into these traps, particularly the rescuing one. That shift really is an identity shift. Going from an individual contributor where you got all your accolades for getting the specific tasks done, being a leader where that's not the case anymore, that is a whole identity shift. And I know you had Melanie Franklin on talking about neuroscience. Our brains going through that identity shift, our brains do not like change and want to protect us and want to keep us in consistent patterns. And that shift, that identity shift to what does it mean now to lead? And unfortunately, I've seen this even in senior leaders, they weren't in their first leadership role, but they were still into this first trap of rescuing because their brains just, that's how they got their credit before. That's how they felt safe.
It's a huge problem too. I've had clients that I have worked with where they've gone from that individual contributor to now they're leading, and they think the rescuing is going to be, that's what their identity is, and they think that's going to be helpful, but it has such a negative impact on the team that they are supposed to be leading and influencing through change or having them spearhead the change. And it can end up creating a really toxic environment too. So how do you coach someone who's in that role of, okay, my identity has been this, but now I need it to be this? What are some strategies that you have there to help people overcome that mindset and make that required shift?
Yeah, well, first is understanding kind of what we mean by rescuing. And that comes from Stephen Karpman's drama triangle. So,
right.
That triangle, there are three vertices. There's the rescuer, there's the victim, and there's the persecutor. The two that really relate mostly to the compassionate, driven leaders that I work with are the rescuer and the victim. And so, again, the rescuer, all the best intentions, doesn't want people to feel bad, knows that the workload is high, doesn't want people to struggle in meeting the demands. So instead, they jump right in and they do that task. Instead of taking maybe the hour at that point that would be required to help that person learn to do that task, they do the task in the 5 minutes themselves.
Right.
What that does then is puts the team member in the victim role, and then they become very reliant on the leader. And the interesting thing is, not only does it lead to potential burnout for the leader because their workload is doubled with one team member and multiples with however many they have, but it can also lead to burnout of the team member. Gallup shows that one of the main reasons for burnout is the perception of unfair treatment. So if you're jumping in and rescuing one team member and not the other, or they don't perceive it as being equal, that can be a problem. So to your question about, what are some strategies, how to help people kind of get through that, once they see that can up the motivation a little bit to think, okay, well, what do I do now? And, the strategies aren't necessarily groundbreaking. It's not something that you don't hear in all the leadership development literature that's out there. But the first one is really providing clear expectations and feedback.
Yep.
And that clear expectations gets at another one of Gallup's causes for burnout, which is the lack of clear expectations. But it's also, particularly with compassionate driven leaders, and I fell into this myself. I'm like, I trust my people. I'm just going to give them the vision and let them go. And, I don't want to micromanage, so I'm just going to do that. And that's not necessarily clear expectations.
Right.
Clear expectations is, this is what it looks like. This is why we're doing it. Here are the milestones we need to hit. Here is how we're going to check in on these milestones so that people can get that stability, which is another core need of team members. They understand what's coming and their brains can then feel a little bit better. They're able to predict what's coming next.
Which is so needed. Yeah. Our brains require that. It demands it.
Exactly. And then the feedback, it's about not just providing feedback, but understanding how the team members like to get feedback and what kind of feedback is impactful for them. One woman I coached, she had a team member who, really seemed defensive anytime she kind of approached her with feedback. And she's like, I cannot figure out what's going on. Like, I'm doing the same thing I'm doing with the other team members. And we got to a point where it was, okay, well, let's ask her how she likes to really receive feedback. And let's ask, what matters to you in your work? How you define success of your work. And it turned out, whereas this leader really defined success in how other people were feeling about her work, this particular team member, it was more about if she was being seen as credible. So that completely shifted how this leader was able to deliver feedback to her. So that's one of the tips, the clear expectations and feedback. And then, normalizing accountability. I know you've had Maria Ross.
I was going to mention it.
And, it is about, what are our team norms? How are we going to work together? What are we going to do if things go off the rails a bit? How are we going to support each other, and how are we going to challenge each other as well? Getting those norms established before you get in that situation is another way that can help you to avoid being tempted to jump into that rescue.
Yes. Yep. Oh, I love that. And Maria also talks about too, which I'm sure you weave into, not exactly the same way, but holding people accountable. You can still be empathetic and kind. And that it doesn't mean you let people walk all over you, which I think the rescuing piece can get, people might feel that way too if they're in the rescuing stance, that they are getting walked on as a result. And so accountability can really, I guess, remove that from being part of the narrative. So that's great. What else? Is there any other strategies, or do you want to pivot to the well-being piece? That's the second kind of trap that people fall into.
My background is in learning and development. And so there's a concept called scaffolding. So it is about getting people out of their comfort zone in terms of what they think they are capable of, but providing the support for them to succeed in that task. It really is about knowing what your team members' strengths are, knowing what their passions are, their definition of success, and then knowing how you can assign them tasks that are just outside of that comfort zone so that they can develop. And you are not there to do that task for them. You are there to provide them support for that. So that is another strategy for developing the team so that you don't feel that need to jump into that rescuer role.
Yeah, got it. This is so, as you were describing that, it made me think of a previous boss I had many, many moons ago. And she admitted that she was not great at developing people. And, a leader is a responsibility. And I love what you're inviting people to think about and apply. I wonder if you ran into this in the way that I have, where there's this idea that it is the responsibility of the individual who is being managed to manage up and predict what the leader wants and bring that conversation to the table and clarify their expectations for themselves, which was what this individual who I reported to, that was her expectation. But then it ended up being, every individual on the team had their own level of expectations, and that wasn't overall healthy for the dynamics of the team. Have you run into that before? And if so, how do you, maybe it's for the individual contributor or the person being managed, anything that they can say or do to change that dynamic, or any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think first off, it's definitely a partnership.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that it's all on the leader and that, in a sense, you have children that, don't have any responsibility
Yeah.
for managing up. Someone is an individual contributor in that role. I think it gets around to really understanding and asking questions in team meetings, for example, where there are other people present about what the leader's vision is, not on their specific task, but maybe starting off there so that you get to that level playing field in terms of information that's shared across the teams.
Yeah,
don't
that makes sense.
hopefully end up in that situation like you were talking about, where it's, just a leader with almost like a wheel with they're the hub, and then you have each individual contributor as different spokes. That's not a team necessarily.
Yeah.
So it is
how like,
and then you're losing all the benefits of being on a team from both sides.
Yeah. And the way that, kind of tying this back to the concept of change and organizational change, you have many different people rowing in many different directions. And so progress and change happens so much slower, and there's so many more conflicts and overlaps. And I wouldn't advise that being the leadership approach. But I love how you said it is a partnership, because it is. There has to be balance though on both sides. And I love the idea of people bringing this up in an appropriate way. Like, what's your vision and how do we align on this together? That creates room for that conversation, which is really healthy and productive for the entire team. So thank you for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I also want to be realistic about understand the desire to rescue because of the immense workload that our leaders are under. And they just feel like they don't have the time. But I would challenge you on, is the time you're saving now costing you many more hours in the future? But we're focusing on two topics this quarter on Strong Leaders Serve, the podcast, and it addresses those specific challenges of workload and disconnection too, that I think are very important, and I've heard from my clients are very important when they are compassionate driven leaders. So I did want to just give that caveat that I'm not up here saying, in the ivory tower saying, you need to, stop that rescuing. I don't know why you're doing it. I completely understand and have experienced why leaders do it.
And yes, so thank you for that as well. And for those of you that are listening or watching, go check out the Strong Leaders Serve podcast. It is, we're in 2025, so I'm guessing these episodes will come out in the first quarter of 2025. So check those out. Check out all of her episodes, but that'll help further the knowledge and information that we're talking about today. Okay, so let's pivot to the topic of well-being and how leaders, strong leaders, they can end up neglecting themselves, or they're making trade-offs because they think that they need to, but in reality, they're actually, they need to not be doing those things. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to leaders feel that in order to serve as a leader, they need to kind of put others' needs in front of their own. Yeah. And what I say is, well, first of all, our definition of leadership is courageously using your talents to make a way for others to courageously use theirs.
I love that.
In order for that to happen, you have to have the first half true. You have to know what your talents are, what your values are, how you want to show up as a leader, and what it's going to take for you to courageously do that. Because as a compassionate, driven leader who wants to create positive change, there are going to be a lot of moments that require courage. And I always say that your effectiveness as a leader of others is directly related to how well you know yourself and how well you are able to, in a sense, put your oxygen mask on first. Now, I know that's very overused, and what I like to, the caveat I like to put on that is we're not doing self-care and self-development just for the sake of putting your oxygen mask on. The rest of that statement is, why are you putting that oxygen mask on? It's so that you can serve others, so that you can help others put their oxygen masks on. So knowing yourself and knowing your values, knowing your strengths, knowing who you want to be as a leader helps you in several ways to not burn out as a leader who serves. One of those is knowing those values helps you to set your priorities and set your boundaries.
That makes a ton of sense, because when you operate from a place where it's in alignment with your core values, then that's going to allow you to make better choices and decisions. So yeah, that's great.
Exactly. Exactly. And getting back to that challenge of workload that we just talked about, one of the things that teams need their leaders to be able to do is to be able to say no, or to say not yet, or to say, what is the need that's causing this request? And is what you're asking for actually going to solve the root cause?
Yeah, that's an important one, because I think in the workplace, I don't think I know. There's a tendency to say yes and just figure it out later. And then you end up having way too many priorities, and then nothing really is a priority because you've got too much on your plate. There's too many things happening at once. So that one really resonates.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the other tip that I give people to avoid neglecting themselves is really spend a little bit of time understanding what your strengths are, what gives you energy, what you can do with ease, because once you know what those strengths are, you can actually find ways to squeeze them into your day when you need a boost.
Yep.
So for example, I know that being a learner is one of my strengths. If I'm feeling down or I need that energy boost in some way, popping in a 10-minute podcast can actually give me that energy boost that I need, because that is one of my strengths. So taking some time to investigate that can help you to have those micro moments of rejuvenation throughout your day.
Yeah, versus just plugging through the entire time. You can kind of create that space for that rest, recovery, and then get right back to it. That's really helpful. What about the third trap that service-oriented leaders get into? Let's talk about that now.
Yeah, so that is always being nice.
Yeah.
And so the twist on that is, I'm not saying that leaders shouldn't be kind. I'm saying that they don't always have to be nice. And the difference there, nice is being pleasing and being agreeable. Mm-hmm. Kind is being helpful and being considerate.
Okay. So, I like the distinction there.
Yeah. And, so as a leader, I may need to courageously engage in a difficult conversation, but I do that from the perspective of, this is something that is going to help the entire team, as it may be a little bit uncomfortable for this one person and for me, to be honest, but it is truly kind, because it is something that they needed to hear, and it's something that's going to benefit the entire team. So, always being kind as a leader is really thinking about the entire team and what's best for everyone. But it's also thinking about the long-term impacts as opposed to the short-term potential pain that you might have to go through in order to get there. And then it's also, about immediately addressing unhelpful behaviors.
Right.
There's short-term discomfort there, but there's definite long-term gain in terms of the psychological safety that's going to be on the team, in terms of how people are going to feel that you as a leader are a source of stability for them. And it's going to keep you from burning out as well, because you aren't doing that bending over backwards that always being nice requires.
And it seems like if you're choosing to be kind, you're having those difficult conversations, that's also a way to hold people accountable. And then, to your point, prevent that burnout from trying to rescue and do everything yourself. So what I really like about how you think and how you coach is that everything you've described, you said it earlier, it's not rocket science, it's not groundbreaking, but the real challenge, and this even applies to simple things like diet and exercise, we kind of know what we need to do, but it's the consistency, the intentionality, and actually doing those things is really what kind of makes the big difference. And that's why having a coach like yourself is someone who can help you through that process, which is really, really valuable. I've had coaching myself. I coach clients and for, different topics, but I love that you're there to provide people who are in that space of being compassionate and service oriented into really unlocking their potential so they can lead themselves and others through change, which is what all leaders are going to be expected to do at some point, if not continuously throughout their career. So just so much wisdom here. Any other tips or insights that you have acquired throughout your kind of years of coaching and leading and serving others that we haven't yet talked about?
Yeah, I would just double down on what you just said about, I would just encourage people to find a partner, whether that be a coach, whether that be a community. Because again, getting back to the neuroscience of it, we can have all the facts, we can know what we want to do, but unfortunately, we have all these neural pathways that are very well established.
Yeah.
They're very hard to change unless you have a shift in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that shift in perspective is really hard to do yourself. Was a leader who was like, I've got this. I just need to read all the books and, listen to all the podcasts and I'll be able to excel. And then once I got a coach that was able to reflect back to me, some of the stories that were getting in my way, some of the perspectives that perhaps needed to change so that I could change the habits that I'd been trying for years to change, that I could see situations in a different way that kind of unlocked what the next step was. Until I did that, I really didn't progress in the way that I wanted to progress.
Yeah. Having been in that seat before, I can fully attest to what you're saying. It is such a transformative experience, whether it's a coach or an accountability partner. I love that you just said that. This has been so insightful. Where can people find you? What's the best way to get in touch if they're interested in you've got your podcast, Strong Leaders Serve. I'm guessing that's on all streaming platforms. I know you're on LinkedIn. Your website is, I believe, Strong Leaders Serve as well. Is that right?
It is. It is. Like to keep everything simple. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. Definitely send me a note to let me know you heard me on this podcast and heard this conversation. And then if people are interested in exploring these traps a little bit further, I do have an assessment that goes through these 3 traps. Cool. It's a very quick assessment with some resources to assist if one trap is particularly troublesome for you. Mm-hmm. So you can find that just at strongleaderserve.com/resources.
Fantastic. So please do let Teri know if you heard this conversation through this podcast. Please check out her resources. I have learned from this conversation and just from reading and listening to Teri. So thank you so much. This was truly a delight to have you on. I'm so grateful that you took time today to share your wisdom with the Change Leader Insights community. And I hope that they now follow Strong Leaders Serve. Check out your stuff, because my belief is that when, a rising tide raises all boats. So I'm hoping that if they hear something that resonates and it just inspires them to take that next step of unlocking their full potential so they and the people they work with can thrive. Thank you again, Teri. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Jessica. You too.